Broadcasting from the News Radio 102.9 KARN Radio Center and Studio 1B, it is Gwatney Unplugged with Scott Romine.
Hey, Scott Romine, you're going to need to put on your red headband for today's show. I'm so excited about this. David Morrell, he's a best-selling author who released his very first novel, First Blood, back in '72, which would actually become a Sylvester Stallone franchise just 10 years later. He also wrote the novelizations of Rambo 2 and Rambo 3, plus storylines for so many things I love, like Captain America and Spider-Man comics. He's truly responsible for one of the greatest pieces of Americana, Rambo. How are you, Mr. Morrell?
I'm very good and happy to say that in this time of pandemic, I'm healthy.
Yes, that's right. We all got to stay safe and be careful with all that. I wanted to ask you, you grew up in Canada, right?
I did. And there's a built-in irony here that a Canadian created one of the most recognizable American icons.
Yeah, I thought that. What did you grow up reading and watching, though? Because something influenced you.
Well, in those days, Canada and the United States were fairly comparable. Basically, American culture seeped into Canada. But in my youth, in 1967, that was Canada's centennial, and having been founded in 1867. And in Montreal, there was an event called Expo 67, and the nation changed in that week of celebration about Canada, in which Canadians began to ask about their history and their culture and other things. So I was sort of after that. I was still influenced. After 67, probably if I'd been raised in Canada, I never would have thought of writing Rambo. But having been a prior to 67 person, I was still, as I said, American culture seeped into the U.S. at that time. It's not the case anymore. So anyway, to jump ahead, I moved to the United States to go to graduate school at Penn State. And I moved there during the Vietnam War and was who knew in Canada about the Vietnam War? It wasn't reported. So this was like a new thought to me, and I was watching in surprise what was happening in the United States with regard to the Vietnam War. And I, as a Canadian citizen, didn't have the right really to talk about it. Mm-hmm. I was a visitor. But observing and all, I eventually decided to write First Blood, which became my disguised version of what was happening in the United States at that time between those people who were fiercely in favor of the war and other people who were as fiercely against it. It was, in a way, you can say the film's like an allegory, and it was an experience that tried to hide my themes so that I didn't seem like I was offering political opinions, and I think that's why the novel. This is. As we record this in October of 2020, and that novel, First Blood, was published in '72, and it's never been out of print.
Ever.
And I think ever. And I think that's plus all the many, I think it was in 30 languages. But, in the United States, I think the reason it stayed in print is because it wasn't, even though it was written because of political events, it isn't a political novel. You could read it today, and you wouldn't notice that. I think the Vietnam War is mentioned maybe twice.
Right.
But so anyway, it was a kind of a paradox, kind of ironic that that's how it happened.
It's interesting to me that we hear about it all the time, but you explored PTSD before PTSD was a known thing, really.
That's correct, and to understand my perspective on that, I have to understand my model for the character, who was America's most decorated soldier of World War II, Audie Murphy, and the Murphy citation for his Medal of Honor makes Rambo look like a Boy Scout. I mean, Murphy was the real thing. He did what Rambo does in stories and exceeded it in real life. And after the war, he came home and was sort of adopted into Hollywood because he was, it was the patriotic thing to do. And Murphy made a lot of westerns, some very cheap budgets, but many of them are very good. There's an Audie Murphy movie, my favorite, called No Name on the Bullet, in which all it takes is his presence in a town to drive everybody crazy. Just the reputation for him having been a killer. And that's the way people related to Murphy in real life, that they say his eyes were very, very cold. In one occasion, a co-star of his, a female co-star, had been made to cry by an assistant director, and Audie went over to him and said, "Make her cry again, and I'll kill you." And like when Audie Murphy said it, you sort of thought, well,
yeah,
maybe he would.
Yeah.
But he had terrible trouble. He had written a book called To Hell and Back about his experiences in European theater, but he also intended, he died too young in a plane crash, in his 40s, intended to write a second book about what it was like to try to adjust to peacetime. And he woke up screaming. He had a pistol under his pillow. He often shot up his bedroom. He had troubles, sleeping and all the rest of it. And while there was no name for PTSD at that time, sometimes they called it shell shock. He certainly had it. And so he was my model. And then later, the term PTSD actually came to be current when the second Rambo movie, Rambo First Blood Part 2, came out in '85. And I remember being on a radio show at that time and hearing the moderator talk about PTSD and not knowing what it was. It was that new. And in fact, the show was about the psychological, the condition. So, in a way, the novel was ahead of its time.
It was, and it's unheard of what you did. You write your first novel, and it's that big of a hit. Did you have any idea what it would become?
Impossible to do. To put it in perspective, and I think I can say this without sounding stuck on myself, because I find this whole thing, really bizarre at what has happened with the character. But if you look at the big action characters that came out of novels, you have Sherlock Holmes, you have Tarzan, you have James Bond, you have Rambo, and you have Harry Potter as the big five in the 20th century. When I was writing the book, what I was trying to do was find a new way to write action. The standard, it just drives me crazy when I read thrillers and shots rang out or gun smoke filled the air, even though modern ammunition doesn't have gun smoke.
Right.
It just drives me crazy, all the cliches that flew around. And I thought, was there a way, if I concentrated, to find new expressions for those, to replace those tired ones? And I remember my agent, authors generally need a literary agent to, you're a fool if you represent yourself. I remember him saying that the action was so strong that he wasn't sure that he'd be able to get a publisher. And if he did, it'd probably be a paperback publisher, because they tended to be a little more lenient about that kind of thing. But instead, in 6 weeks, he did have a hardback publisher, and it was reviewed in just about everywhere, and mostly positively. The Time magazine review was negative. It was the only big review that was negative, and they attacked the novel on the basis of the action, or to put it more strongly, the violence in it. In doing so, they said I'd invented something new, and I felt, I felt kind of pleased by that, because that was the whole point.
Mr. Morrell, did you take issue with any of the changes they made for the movies of Rambo, or the first one?
No. I've been in the movie business a long time, doing other things. I'm a member of the Writers Guild of America, which is basically screenwriters. And I know that novels and books, novels and films need to be different. And what you say is true. In my novel, First Blood, Rambo does not have a first name because I wanted the sound of force, and I couldn't have it, saying John ran through the forest. Rambo ran through the forest.
Yes.
So I always used his last name, and added a kind of mystery that he didn't have a first name for the film. And we have to remember there were 26 scripts written for various versions of the film.
Oh, geez.
It had been at Columbia, and then it was at Warner Brothers, and then it was at another studio, and then finally it was with Carol Co. Pictures. And there were 26 scripts lying around that had been developed here and there. In fact, at one time, Steve McQueen was Rambo with Sidney Pollack directing. But they finally realized that Steve, in his mid-40s, could not, in 1975, portray a Vietnam veteran because there were no 45-year-old Vietnam veterans. It was a young person's war,
That's
unlike
true.
Iran, what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, where you often had people in the 40s and 50s in that war. So the character. Now we got to back up. I was talking about the movies. What was your question? And
if you had taken issue with any of the changes, of course, the ending's different and things like that.
I got it. I get so interested talking about this and that, then I sometimes wind up answering one question and not another. There were changes. The biggest change is the ending of the film. Which perhaps we don't want to talk about, but the novel and the film end quite differently. And in the original film actually ended more or less as my novel does, but audiences objected so much that the producers went back and reshot the film so that, not to put too much of a mystery on it, Rambo lived,
right,
and thus there could be sequels.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the big change. Another change was that the novel takes place in Kentucky and was transported to the Pacific Northwest, filmed actually in Canada because the financing was better up there.
Yes.
And the other change is that the police chief's character is minimized in the novel in the film compared to my novel, where in the novel the police chief and Rambo have equal. The chapters alternate, and each has the same amount of pages.
And Rambo speaks more in your book.
He does, yes. Now, one reason he doesn't speak much in the movie is that these Mario Casar and Andrew Vanya, who were the executive producers, were experts in international film distribution. And they knew the problems that dialogue had when it was translated into other languages, plus it's costly.
Yes.
So they decided if they had the less dialogue, the better. So in a way, it's a silent movie except for the gunshot.
That's true.
And Jerry Goldsmith's wonderful music. That's one reason why he doesn't talk much.
Hey, what's your memory of Kirk Douglas being involved in the first film?
Well, I never met Kirk, but Kirk was the first choice to play Colonel Troutman. There are publicity of drawings of him in costume that appeared in Hollywood Reporter and places like that. Kirk, so the story goes, some of this has been, there are different versions. Kirk showed up, and there were disagreements about how the story would end. I think Kirk wanted the novel's ending. I have no means for saying this. All I know is that there were what were called creative disagreements. And Kirk was there apparently for a week and left on a Friday, shocking everybody. And then Lynn Stallmaster, the great casting person, whom I live in Santa Fe, and one day I was at a tennis club, and by God, there was Lynn Stallmaster. He also was a member of the tennis club, and so I had a chance to talk to him about this. And And he said that it was quite a weekend with them trying to find somebody who would be absolutely dependable, who could step in Monday morning and, wouldn't, and would be steady. And Richard Crenna's name kept coming up, and
Yes.
he was offered the part on Sunday, and Monday he was on his way to British Columbia.
It had to be Richard Crenna. I mean, to me,
Now,
I grew
yeah,
up with
now.
it,
Yeah, exactly. And he was, by the way, a fine person. I had a chance to spend time with him and have several conversations, and he was just as nice in his various roles as you would expect him to be in person. And I used to kid him. He played the bad guy, so to speak, in. Oh darn! I'm losing the title. It's a film noir with Kathleen Turner.
Oof, I'm not sure on that one.
He played the husband that William Hurt had to kill, and Richie was only in it, Body Heat, and Richie was only in it for like 10 minutes, but he sort of anchored the film as the antagonist. And I used to kid him and say, "Oh man, you did a great job in Body Heat," and it bothered him a little because he was only in it for 10 minutes.
Right.
Great fun.
Hey, don't take this the wrong way, but in my mind, I always kind of thought of Rambo kind of like Jaws, where the first film is plausible, and then every sequel kind of becomes more of a cartoon characterization of the thing.
Uh-huh.
Did you ever think that, or did it ever bother you that Rambo kind of became, the first film is realistic. And then after that, they've now created the one-man army, which was copied every which way it could be copied.
Well, it certainly was influential. The character in my novel is slightly different, actually more than slightly different, with the movie. Mine is an angry man at what happened to him in Vietnam, very angry. Whereas in the movie, he's a victim. Society has not respected him because he was in the war, and it's a legitimate interpretation of the character. In the second movie, he is now the reverse of that character, and he's now almost jingoistic. He's almost instead of being about the problems of PTSD that service people had. In the second one, he's almost a poster child for let's go kill the communists or whatever. And that's the same character in the third film, but in the fourth film, Sly phoned me one day to talk about that fourth film and said that he thought, in retrospect, the second and third films glorified the violence too much, and that he wanted to go back to the novel and have the character be like he was in my novel, so that in a way the fourth film is different again, but also the same as my novel.
I love the fourth one.
It's very good, and the director's extended cut, which is on Blu-ray,
I've got it. That is a completely different film. Yeah, I have the 4K you're talking about. It is not the same movie at all.
So I told me that that version, the first one, that is to say, the first version of the fourth movie, this gets hilarious, all these numbers.
Yeah.
I think it was called John Rambo.
That's right.
That he said that it was edited subsequently. It was condensed, and he just wasn't absolutely happy with how that theatrical version turned out, but that he loved the ability to have his director's cut, which is almost a different film.
Oh, and it's wonderful. We got to take a quick break here on Gwatney Unplugged. We're talking with David Morrell, the writer of First Blood, the inventor of Rambo. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Gwatney Unplugged. We're talking with David Morrell. He is the writer of First Blood and inventor of Rambo. I got to ask you about, because we're in Arkansas and I'm Arkansan, I got to ask you about the Arkansas connection, Jimmy Lyle, that made those famous knives. Do you have one of the knives?
I do. I have replica knives from all of them. I didn't have a chance to meet Jimmy Lyle, the Arkansas... what was his tag? He's the Arkansas Knifesmith, I think he
Yes,
called.
He was.
And,
that's right.
And I was writing the novelization for the second movie, and I did the novelizations because I wanted. There was a lot in the movie that needed amplifying. For example, Rambo goes back to the prisoner of war camp from which he escaped, but he never has any, like, there's no psychological reaction to him going back to where he was tortured. And it seemed to me that, in a novel, I could explore this and make him more of a person in relation to him and what it would cost him to go back. And so when I was doing the novelization, I thought that the knives would make a nice topic to address.
Oh, yes.
In the book. So the producers got me in touch with Jimmy, and I had a wonderful conversation. I only talked to him once, maybe for a half hour. He was telling me about the knives, and for the 1 and 2 he did, and why he designed them that way, and the Randall knife prototype that from which he was in the survival knife that he was adapting to make the Rambo knife and things like that. And I found his Arkansas accent to be so pronounced that I talked like him for about 2 days afterwards. It was hilarious, but he was a great artist. The cutlery business, as it is called, was barely existed in 1982 when the Rambo knife was invented, and basically rejuvenated it so that knife makers once again had a market. So he had an important place in not only in film history but in other, in the cutlery industry for that. And then of course he made the different but similar knife for the second one. And then God bless him, he died.
Yeah.
And so Gil Hibben, who I know well and have talked to and met many times, Sly was a fan of Gil's for a long time. Sly collects knives. And he met Gil at an event, a knife event, and it's a good story. Gil was barely able to pay the phone bill or the electric bill, and Sly came in and looked at all the knives and bought them all.
Oh my gosh!
Knife show, bought them all, and then said, "You want to do the knife for Rambo 3?" And changed Gil's life. The knife, it's a bigger knife. The knives get bigger each time. So Gil did the knives and the machete for Rambo 4. I call it Rambo 4.
I love Rambo 4.
Anyhow, each of these, Jimmy made replica knives for me and stamped them as author's copy. And Gil made knives for me with the same author's copy on them. So, they're prized possessions. You
were on the set of these movies. So do you have anything memorabilia? Do you have a headband or a bow or anything actually screen used?
I have nothing from the movies themselves. The bow manufacturer for Rambo 2 did give me one of the bows and the arrows, which are collapsible.
It's Horton, I think, right? Horton,
yes, that's
Horton,
right.
Yeah.
Hoyt.
Hoyt, that's right.
Yeah, and nice people. And I have in my study one, but it a bow with the knife, but it was not in the film. It is not an actual, it's the commercial bow. But I have some memorabilia, around here to do with it, and lots of Rambo toys. God knows there were a lot of Rambo toys.
Believe me, I grew up playing with them. I promise you. Did it blow you away when Rambo became a children's cartoon?
Well, you listen to my speechlessness here. the character has gone in a lot of directions. He's now in the Mortal Kombat universe.
I saw that. That's right.
As a video game. I mean, he got all over. They had to, with the children's cartoon, it's kind of the genteel Rambo. He's in the forest talking to animals and
well, yeah,
and campfires and all that. And they couldn't use Sly's likeness for financial reasons. So it's a kind of a brawny looking character, and we have Jerry. They did use Jerry Goldsmith's fabulous movie. I'm just a huge Jerry Goldsmith fan.
Oh, definitely.
And they did. I think there are 26 of them, and they're available. At least they were on DVD, and they're kind of fun to look at them just to see how the music is used and how they kind of gentrified the character.
It's kind of the G.I. Joe version of Rambo in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've always heard that one of your biggest fans was Ronald Reagan, that he loved Rambo. Did that ever filter back to you? Did you know that?
No, I knew about it. It did not come back to me. Sly and I were talking one day. I have to be careful. He and I are like, aren't buddies. We've never had dinner together, but we have talked a lot. I remember we were sharing the unusual experience, talking about it in conversation about how we'd be watching TV or reading some, a newspaper or what have you, and somebody would talk about Rambo, and I relate to the name and the character as being a part of American culture, and then suddenly realize we created that person. So there was kind of a bit of a second or two lag before we identified with what we had done, it's quite a surprise. But to hear the President of the United States, in that case Ronald Reagan, to go on television and say that he had seen a Rambo movie the night before, now he knew. Well, now he knew. He said, now he knew what to do the next time there was a terrorist hostage crisis.
Yeah.
And that wasn't the only example. President Reagan, talked about Rambo a lot in press conferences, and I'd have to look up the date. The United States bombed, military Air Force bombed Libya at one time. And I can't remember, it was sometime in the late 80s. And I was in London promoting a novel at the time, and I looked at the headline of the newspaper that had been delivered with breakfast, and the headline read, U.S. Rambo jets bomb Libya.
Rambo jets.
Yeah. So it's around. It's an Oxford English Dictionary featured the name in
sure.
its own as a word. And what I often get asked where the name came from, and this is not very romantic, but it is, or dramatic, but it's interesting. In Pennsylvania, where I went to graduate school, my wife, we had nothing, and she was out with a pittance like 25 cents, and she managed to buy apples at a roadside stand. And she brought the apples home, and I was working on the novel. I didn't have a name for the character. All I had was blank. Eat the apple. No, I'm working. Out of here. No, eat the apple. The great genius. So I said, all right, hoping my wife would leave me alone. And I bit into the apple and said, hey, it tastes pretty good. And then I said that fateful question that everyone asks in biting into an apple, what's it called?
Yeah.
And the answer is it's a Rambo apple.
I mean, I'm a super fan of Rambo, and most people don't know that James Cameron has a connection to Rambo, the Terminator guy. Could you explain that connection?
Oh, absolutely. It's a wonderful connection. Cameron, having done the Terminator, I believe that I have the sequence correct, the first film, and he'd worked for Corman, and, he was around, and in the business, and they had a good reputation. And Carolco hired him to write the first script for Rambo: First Blood Part 2. And that script had basically the same storyline, but it had a sidekick for Rambo. And the sidekick, as you read it, and you remember that Sly had directed John Travolta in the sequel to Saturday Night Fever,
Mm-hmm.
that the sidekick was almost certainly going to be John Travolta.
See, I'd heard Kurt Russell. I've heard Kurt Russell would have been that character.
He could have done it in those days. We're talking 1984 when they would have filmed. That both of them could have done it, but if you read it, it just sounds so much like Travolta.
Mm-hmm.
And in any case, they decided that they didn't want the sidekick, and so a few other things changed. The biggest change, apart from that, was the opening, in which Troutman visits a hospital for wounded vets. And the hospital has a psychiatric wing. And Rambo is in the basement at the end of a long corridor behind a steel iron door, whatever, with bars on it, with a armed guard outside.
Yeah, he's not out on the boulders, chopping the boulders up or whatever, we know.
No, and he shows up, Troutman shows up to offer him the deal to go back to Vietnam. And the light is through the bars of the room is dark, and the guard says to Troutman, he smashed the light again. He thinks he's still the expletive Prince of Darkness. And I said to Andy Vanya, I just loved Andy. He's no longer with us, one of the executive producers. I said, Andy, it's such a great opening. He said, yeah, but it makes him sound like a nutcase. So we changed it to him splitting rocks, plus we got his shirt off right away.
Oh, of course.
So when I did the novelization, the script was pretty thin for the shooting script, but what I found... I said, Andy, there's not much here. Like, literally, the script was Rambo jumps up and shoots this guy. Rambo jumps up and shoots that guy.
Well, sure he does.
That was the script. And I said, I need more than this. Have you got anything else? And he said, well, oh, yeah, we had a James Cameron script. What? So they had hired him. And they sent me the script. And oh my heavens, it had so much neat stuff. So I broke all the rules. Normally, with a novelization, you're supposed to be slavish to the script as it was finally filmed. But as the creator of the character, I had a latitude that other novelizations don't normally have. And so what it became was my book of the film became 1/3 shooting script, 1/3 James Cameron, and 1/3 mine. For example, addressing the issue of Rambo going back to the camp where he had been tortured and from which he escaped.
Can I be very honest with you? And I'm wondering if you've heard this before. I know that First Blood is the best movie of all of them and the best story and everything. I am in love with the second one. That's my favorite one because I was 12 years old and it's a live action cartoon in a way.
Yeah.
And it just made the impression on me that this is Rambo, I don't know, the scene where he steals the chopper and comes back and takes out to me, it's just, it's wonderful. I mean, it's just so well done. I don't know if you hear that. Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm not a fan of the third film. I like the fourth a lot, but in terms of fun, the second one, it's just fun.
And we have to get past all this. There's a certain what would be the word? Political correctness you have to get past for that film. And I remember talking to a trainer at Fort Bragg who said that they'd watched the movie and they were rolling around on the ground on the floor of the theater practically, because in the scene where Rambo pretends his helicopter has been compromised and he's got the rescued prisoners in the back of the helicopter and he picks up an
an RPG.
Yeah, and he fires it, blowing up the huge
The Hind,
Russian
the
aircraft.
big Hind
But
aircraft.
but the backblast would have killed all his rescued prisoners.
Well, yeah. Okay. Yeah. The trigger he's pulling on the grip in the helicopter is like the radio transmit button. I've read that,
Or the bow manufacturer was furious because this isn't sly. I mean, none of this is meant to be disrespectful, but the bow had arrow clip on it. I think this is in the third one.
Mm-hmm.
And now the arrows are meant to be pointed down toward the ground with the fletch up around the shooter's eyes.
Right.
But that doesn't photograph, so they reversed the arrows so that the arrows were now in line with the shooter's eyes, which is, hardly what you want. And the bow manufacturer was furious because of the potential for lawsuits if somebody started doing that stuff. I called it Rambo of the Jungle. I thought of it as a cross between a Tarzan movie and a Western. And like the fight in the helicopter is comparable to a fight on the stagecoach.
Oh, of course. That's what it is.
He does everything but swing through the trees on vines and all that. It's a hilarious film. I mean, it's a sort of in the spirit of Indiana Jones.
Yep.
But the music, I think Jerry's music is better in that one than in the first one.
It is.
But as you say, the first one is serious and changed American culture and its attitude toward veterans of unpopular wars. The second one didn't change. Well, I don't know about that. It did become a poster of a kind of a recruitment film.
Oh, sure.
Which the first one is not. So, different Rambos, different for different films. In 2010, I was part of the first USO authors group to go to a war zone. I went to Iraq. Anyhow, we went to 2 military hospitals before we went overseas. And we went to rooms, I still remember this, rooms man without one leg, without 2 legs, without an arm, without 2 arms, without any legs or arms.
Mm.
And I cannot tell you the number of times when that person said to me he had joined the military because of the Rambo films. And I said to him, I guess in a way I'm responsible for what happened to you. And he said, no, he knew what he was getting into, and it was the movies that made him do it. And I keep thinking, for everything there are 2 sides.
And I've seen pictures like people in Iraq, they've painted Rambo on the barrel of their tank. And I mean, yeah. I don't know how would that feel to see that when you created that? I mean,
well, he was on. Someone wrote his name on the Berlin Wall as it came down, and this is the other side of it. I was in Poland in 2001 on a book tour. A female journalist said to me that in 89, 90, during the revolt, Polish revolt against the USSR. That the Rambo films, which were illegal in Poland, had been smuggled in tape form, in those days VHS, and that the demonstrators, at least her group, watched the film or films and then dressed up as Rambo and then went out to demonstrate against the Soviet soldiers.
It's unreal.
And, so I just gaped at that because you never know what's going to happen, where things will go. So, it's a powerful, big subject.
Hey, we appreciate your time so much today. And I just want to say personally, thank you for all the things you have written and created. It has meant the world to me. Scott Romine, Guatney Unplugged. Go have a great Saturday. We will see you next week.